IoT space. If you hear many of the experts in this space speak, one of the things they always talk about is the need for domain expertise. And I'm hoping that you walk away from this today with some type of understanding of the expertise that is necessary to properly secure resources in the IoT space. We'll cover some of the unique challenges, and I'll give you a couple of recommendations and some of my thoughts, and hopefully it'll be a worthwhile discussion for all of the audience. So the outcomes that we are hoping to achieve here, I just listed out in these simple bullets. So definitely an understanding of the challenges, but more importantly, an understanding of the type of knowledge, the granular level necessary to have a positive impact in this space. I can't stress it enough that if you don't know, if you don't really understand what it is you're securing, I don't think you're going to properly be able to secure it. And just blindly putting products in place, you know, that's an approach that gets you only but so far. So let's jump into it. The IIoT, what it is. So let's start with the IoT. So generally a network of interconnected devices. One of the elements that makes this unique is the amount of data that gets put onto network stacks and flows across cables and Wi-Fi connections and all those network entities. But generally speaking, the IoT is a consumer-centric world. The IIoT is certainly focused on other aspects that have an impact on the physical world. And I think that's the key difference in terms of the simplistic way that I like to lay it out. So for example, if you wear a Fitbit, you know, if it malfunctions, if it gets breached via Bluetooth or something like that, there's very little impact on humanity, if you will. But if somebody breaches a traffic control system or somebody reverses the flow of a pump, generally speaking, you're impacting the physical world and a lot more humans than just one device from a consumer perspective. So the IIoT is more focused on these type of entities. So you're talking about medical systems, military systems, robotics as they exist in manufacturing and or military operations. If we get to the end of the presentation, I'll show you a couple of interesting tidbits from the warfare perspective. And certainly other entities that are not user-centric, like prison control systems and traffic light systems and all those kind of systems. Basically, the IoT is pretty much everywhere in terms of our modern day life, and it definitely has an impact on the physical world. Now, how far reaching is it? I just grabbed this slide off Shodan recently. If you look at the highlights there, you'll find it really interesting in terms of exposure. Now, all those clusters of bright lights are IIoT networks that are exposed to the public internet. And so certainly that's got to be a subset, let's hypothetically say less than 50% of what's out there. So there's tons of non-externally networked IIoT entities beyond this, but this is really interesting because these are actual live clusters of devices that you can just hit over the public internet. Anybody that comes from the protective space should see this and find it quite disturbing because I can pretty much tell you a lot of these are not properly secured. They're just out there for the ease of use of the resources that are working on them. Now, one of the things that makes the IoT way interesting beyond what the IT or enterprise space is normally used to dealing with is the heterogeneous aspect of the devices that exist within the networks. So you have engineering workstations and they run HMI software and they run configuration software. And those are your typical, PCs and laptops that everybody's used to. But then you have the dimension of PLCs and VFDs and sensors and all of these devices that don't run typical operating systems, and they don't contain enough resources to run the software, security software in particular, that a lot of IT people are used to, right? Especially cybersecurity people. Like you can't run an antivirus software on a PLC. There's just, the operating system won't support it. And most likely, if it's a legacy device, there's not enough resources on the device to actually run the software. And so I'll show you a couple of examples now, but the heterogeneous aspect that you're looking at within the IIoT space makes it extremely challenging, especially for people from the IT side that are coming over to the OT side to perform security functions. So here are a couple of examples. On the left, you have a device that if you actually look on the left side of the device, you'll see that there's serial and there's networking. And so this device actually takes RS type serial traffic and converts it to and from Ethernet. On the right side, you'll see what is a typical wiring closet. Well, I shouldn't say typical, but it is indicative of wiring closets within the IIoT space. Up top, you'll see a PLC. On the bottom, you'll actually see one of our devices that's in a protective mode. But this is very different than a server rack that is typically seen in the IT space. And I wanted to give you a sense of the difference because there's a lot of serial I/O that happens within this space because you're actually touching physical gear that has an impact on the world. These are a couple of pictures from a project I worked on a few years ago, and these are actual boilers. These are enormous boilers that have an impact on buildings that are 96 plus stories in size. You know, you're talking about enormous buildings in major cities, and all of these get controlled by these simple little PLCs like the ones I just showed you. And you can have a real physical impact on the world if you were to breach one of these things and actually change values outside of ranges and stuff like that. You'll see examples of this in a couple minutes. Focusing down a little more to the human aspect, I thought this slide was great because this is an actual drug pump that's on the market, and a researcher actually breached this device and labeled it as the least secure IP device he had ever seen. And now, you know, you're talking about a device that's actually going to be administering drugs to a human. And this thing was running an embedded web server that was wide open. So, you know, these are not exactly the smartest choices in terms of putting devices out on networks. Here's another example of an individual who had access to a sewage system, and actually he was a disgruntled individual and he reversed the flow, and that had quite an impact on the community. And if you think any of this is new, just look at the date on that. It's from 2001. And so this has been going on for quite some time. It's just that it hasn't really hit the mainstream news because it's just been such a foreign world to the majority of IT and security people. Last example, this was another one that I thought was interesting. These individuals actually put the web server on the public internet that controlled this gondola ride in France. Wide open, there was no security. And so this is, you know, this is really, again, it brings stuff into the realm of impacting human life. And I think it's definitely a different aspect of cybersecurity as we know it. So let me just talk about what's been going on for the last few years. The focus has been on visibility, right? In the IoT space, everybody, 5-6 years ago, everybody's argument was, I don't even know what's on my network. I don't know what to secure. I don't know what type of devices I have on my network. And so there's been a lot of momentum on visibility. And you end up with these awesome, you know, graphs, charts, like I put an example there on the right. And now we're hitting this point that everybody's kind of saying, okay, now what? Like, I know what's on my network. I know who's talking to who, and what am I supposed to do about it? And so I think the exhaustion of the benefit that visibility brings to the table is getting reached. So a couple of differences between IT and OT. The language spoken is radically different. So the communication protocols on the ICS or OT side are absolute foreign languages to normal IT people. You know, IT people are used to text-based protocols, right? HTTP, FTP, SNTP. If you look under the hood, and we're going to look at a bunch of examples, those are text-based for the most part, because even if it's a binary blob, it's base64 encoded, and it still sort of makes sense to the human eye. That's not the case on the ICS side. You're looking at binary protocols operating on networks. And so you have to, it's a mental shift to deal with this kind of data because, first of all, each protocol is so radically different. And then second of all, you're dealing with data in a form that is just not the norm. And so I really want to hit home with these examples because I think they are critical in terms of at least a familiarity with the nuances of these communication protocols, which are at the heart of the IIoT networks. And certainly the physical realities are different, which I just showed you a couple of examples in terms of devices. But the notion of time, I think, is one of the most critical factors. So if I send all of you an email and you get it 15 minutes after I sent it, that doesn't really matter to you. You got the email. The fact that it's 15 minutes late is of no relevance because you probably don't even know when I sent the email. But the notion of time within the IIoT space is critical because device-to-device communication is most likely time synchronized. And if you put security apparatus onto a network that actually disrupts the synchronization of time, then you have a negative impact on the operations. And this is a huge challenge within this space. And so understanding that the notion of time is a reality is certainly something that's foreign to a lot of security professionals that migrate over to this space, and it takes a little getting used to. Now, last X number of years, we've seen exploits that have hit and have had a negative impact on industrial environments. I mean, the Ukrainian power plant incident comes to mind. Certainly Stuxnet comes to mind. I laid out a couple of exploits there for anybody that's not familiar with them and wants to research them. But I think the important point is that all of those are enterprise related. I mean, most of them were actual ransomware incidents that hit PCs that happened to be on the industrial network. They were not native attacks to OT devices. And that's important because that tide is shifting now. And you know, a lot of security entities on the nefarious side are starting to get familiar with these protocols and with these devices and are actually starting to affect native attacks on the OT side. And this is definitely something that's just starting to happen within the last year or two. And it's certainly something that's going to be very relevant to what I'm going to show here on the tech side in a couple of minutes. So active protection. The notion here is simple. Active means that we can take action on network traffic. Now, depending on the protocol, and they're all different, that may mean dropping packets, that may mean blocking certain actions, that may mean severing an entire socket or connection. You have to understand the traffic that you're looking at in order to effectively and properly take action. And so this is where that domain expertise truly comes into play because you can't just treat them all the same way. All these communication protocols are unique. So active protection also means that you're running stuff on a network in its native environment. So architecturally, you can't just drop something close to, let's say, a high-level switch because machine-to-machine traffic may never get there. You need to understand the environment that you're sitting in, and then you can basically have a positive impact by understanding the traffic and understanding the network flows such that you can inject a device there and start to take action. We'll take a look at the Cyberkill Chain. Not all the phases apply because the Cyberkill Chain is enterprise-centric, but certainly some of the phases are relevant and we'll focus on them. And you'll start to get a sense of what this means because you have to understand the attack methodologies in order to properly protect them. Then the other thing here with active protection, like I said, the heterogeneous nature of devices introduces a challenge. So if you're going to put a protective mechanism in place to protect Windows desktops, that's probably going to have very little impact on a historian server or a PLC because they're radically different machines. They run different OSs, they perform different functions, and by their sheer nature on the IIoT network, they're just different entities. And so you can't just put one solution in place and expect it to automatically protect all of these devices because it needs to understand their nature, their communications, and the operating systems, all that stuff comes into play. So here's a Cyberkill chain, just something for reference. We won't spend much time on it, but the phases that are important that I'm going to focus on are these: the Recon Phase, some brute force attacks, some native communications. This is where we get into the actual protocols, and understanding that files are relevant on the IIoT side, because I think a lot of security solutions focus on network segmentation and stuff like that, and they kind of forget the fact that you have to actually look at content to be effective from a security perspective. So we're going to jump into Recon. I'm pretty sure everybody in the audience knows what a port scan is. I don't need to go into that. I am going to show you a different perspective in terms of dealing with port data. From a Recon perspective, device enumeration and identification is critical. And again, we're going to look at it at a native protocol level from an ICS perspective. So the majority of the examples I'll show are going to be either Modbus over TCP or DNP3, simply because those are two of the common protocols, and they're relatively straightforward in terms of using examples. So Modbus over TCP. So we're going to look at a Recon example here of a native device ID example. So an attacker wants to know the identifying entity for a Modbus TCP endpoint, because if they can get that, they can then go and construct an intelligent attack as opposed to a blind attack. And obviously, if you're building APT type attacks and stuff like that, understanding your endpoint, your target, is critical. And so if you can get these endpoint devices to tell you who or what they are, you have a huge piece of the puzzle as an attacker. And so on the right here, these are from Wireshark, and you'll see full screens from Wireshark as well as we go along. But basically, what you see on the network is what you see on the right hand of this screen, which is pretty much unintelligible because a lot of these characters are not displayable in ASCII, right? Our eyes are used to seeing ASCII. What you see on the left is hex encoded representations of those exact values. So in this example, we're going to focus on this particular byte. So in this example, it's 2 Bravo in hex. Now, if you go back to what I said earlier, you have to understand the nature of the data that you're looking at. So we're going to convert 2 Bravo to its decimal form, because that's what's going to be relevant for us. And when you convert it, I just put a little interactive Python snippet there on the screen, you're going to get 43 as the decimal. 43 is extremely relevant because if you look at the Modbus function codes, look on the right side all the way to the bottom, function 43 is read device identification. So this is a function that is either going to be used by some type of maintenance software or an attacker. And so an attacker, if they do a port scan or know of some Modbus TCP endpoints, is going to try to decipher as much information as they can about that endpoint. So if you're watching network traffic, whether in analysis or in live mode, and you see this type of activity, this should sort of raise an antenna for you, because obviously somebody's trying to get information out of one of the endpoints that you're trying to protect. And this is an issue. And so a lot of these protocols work off of this notion of function code because they are able to take action on the endpoint device. And so function code 43 in Modbus TCP is certainly something that's of interest. Now here's an example. This is a request sending the function code 43 to an endpoint. So this is with no protection in place. I want you to see what it looks like when it actually works. So this is the request that has gone out, and the response looks like this. Now, if you look on the bottom, on the right side where the binary data normally is, you'll see some ASCII characters that identify the device because the device responded to a request, to the function code 43 request. And so this would be critical information for an attacker, because then they can turn around and go construct an intelligent attack against these devices, right? They would research CVEs, known exploits, stuff like that, and hopefully get a hit, and then they can start banging away at the target and have a really a negative impact, positive from their perspective, negative from ours. Just to give you a little bit of a Python snippet, in case anybody out there is a Python enthusiast, using the PyModbus library, you would be able to send that function code to an endpoint with that line right there that says client.execute. If you look at the function, they abstract the function code for you. I'll show you that on the next slide. But the point is, to write an actual scanner that can get device ID information from all these from multiple endpoints is pretty straightforward in Python. So you're not even looking at a sophisticated level of coding in reference to creating some attack patterns in this space. And so this is right off the GitHub code base for PyModbus. You can see right there on line 46 where the function code 2Bravo is established, and that's how they abstract it out for you as the entity that's using this class. So moving on, an SNMP example. Obviously, SNMP from a system administration perspective is a wonderful protocol. For those who don't know, it's a simple network management protocol, and it gives devices that expose information via SNMP. It gives them the ability to share information that is very useful from a maintenance and administration perspective, but it's also a treasure trove for attackers if they know how to extract that information. So generally, SNMP runs on port 161 over UDP. It can be changed, it can run differently, but you'll generally see this type of a setup on a network. There are 3 major versions. Version 3 added some advanced stuff like authentication. And I'll give you a couple links in a couple slides, but the key point here is that this stuff can be brute forced. The community strings and the authentication can be brute forced. And if you don't know how to read those type of brute force actions on a network, then you'll never be able to stop them. I'll show you an example of Telnet in a couple of minutes, but the point here is that you have to understand what it is you're looking at under the hood. So here's an SNMP example. This is a Wireshark screenshot where we queried the system description OID, object identifier, for a PLC. And the PLC responded by giving us its name. So now I took just a couple of snippets and I pasted them here because this is critical information. The first one is the actual string that identifies the device. And so in and of itself, that's super important information. But the next set of information that was really interesting to me was the fact that via SNMP, I could also get a list of listening ports. So I didn't even have to bother port scanning the device. SNMP gave me all the information I needed to go and start doing some research and or just construct an intelligent attack, because I knew exactly what I was looking at. As you can see there, there's a port 80 listener, most likely a web server. There's port 502, most likely Modbus over TCP. And I say most likely because you can obviously run other services on those ports, but a lot of entities do not do that. They just take the default ports. And so without even running Nmap or anything like that, I got all the information that, well, not all, but I got a bunch of information that I needed via SNMP. So SNMP is certainly something that's useful to know, to understand. These are a couple of links that'll hopefully give you guys some perspective of, I don't want to say abusing, but using SNMP as from an attacking perspective in terms of extracting information from endpoint devices. So I'm going to move on. Brute force attacks. I'm just going to show you one example. I'll show you a video of an example that utilizes Telnet, but generally speaking, everybody understands what a brute force attack is at this point. The key is understanding how to be able to identify it, and then what do you do about it? So let me show you the video first. So if you watch the screen on the bottom as I select different requests, you should notice a pattern there. It's the actual value of interest is highlighted in blue. So if you caught that, I sent admin as the username and password as the password to the backend device, and it basically told me you can't get in. But the key was the fact that Telnet, the way it operates from an authentication perspective, is it sends each character as a separate request. And so if you're trying to identify this type of traffic on a network in order to block it or report on it or any of that stuff, you have to understand how to reconstruct a bunch of packets so that you say, this is the activity I see. And this was just one attempt. So if somebody's brute forcing you, you would be having to maintain state across multiple packets such that you can clearly say we are under a brute force attack within the Telnet protocol. Now, I know a lot of you are sitting there saying, Telnet, oh my God, 20 years old, whatever, nobody uses it anymore. If you look over the last few days, somebody leaked over 500,000 Telnet passwords with external IP addresses for devices that are on the public internet. So Telnet is far from dead. As a matter of fact, Mirai used a lot of Telnet in its attempts at logging into devices when it was a pretty hot item. And so dealing with IIoT devices that are in the legacy space, right, 15, 20 years old, this is still a reality. And so it's something that you need to contend with if you're interested in actively protecting IIoT devices. Now, moving on from that, where it gets really, really interesting is this. So these are set point or range attacks where you're actually attacking values within a given environment. And this is critical because the values are what make the gear operate within certain thresholds, right? And so here's one example that's really interesting, and I'll show you a video that is actually relevant to this. So a variable frequency drive is a little device that controls motors, and the motors can be enormous. And so via Modbus, in this particular example, if you look at these registers that I've laid out there, and you understand that something seemingly simple, like setting register 9001 to a value of 1, tells the motor to accelerate as fast as it can. So imagine the physical impact that could have on a motor. Or if you look at the third example, where you set these 2 registers to 1,000, that means you're putting the motor up at 100%. Now, anybody who deals with physical gear knows that running anything at 100% over a long period of time is just not a physically wise thing to do. And so these are examples that actually have or can have a negative physical impact on the world. Now, I'll show you these in terms of Modbus because that's what we're looking at. So function code 6 in Modbus is to write a register. Now, the example I just gave you, the register was 9001, which in hex, you would see, I highlighted it there, you would see it as 2329. I converted it there on the screen for you. And then you set the value to 1. So this seemingly benign packet hitting a VFD that's controlling a motor could have an enormous physical impact on the world around it, or whatever, that physical gear is touching. And so this is where it starts to become really important in terms of understanding ranges of values, because maybe we only want to accept value 1 from a certain IP or a certain segment on the network, and just not arbitrarily accept it as it flows across the network to a VFD. And this is where being active in your protection starts to become critical. So you can combine a block of this type of activity with a network segmentation rule, for instance, and actually start having a positive impact on a network. So here's a screenshot of the same data, just to give you a sense of what Wireshark would see when you're running this type of traffic. And here's a little snippet. You can see the YouTube video if you want to. I have the link there. But this is basically what a VFD is inside of a given IIoT network. And so this example shows you one motor. You're about to see another video that was on the news some years ago. I'll play it right now. So that video shows literally the physical impact that setting these devices outside of their normal range, the impact is mind-boggling when you start to think about it. This was obviously a contained experiment, but this whole thing was done over network traffic, the same type of packets that I'm showing you in these examples. And I don't know if you noticed, but the motor is pretty large. So you can kind of start doing the math in your head in terms of the type of impact that this would have on the world. So in the cybersecurity, in the IT side of cybersecurity, there's the CIA model, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. That order is reversed on the ICS or OT side, where it's AIC, and availability is the most critical aspect to OT environments. In other words, if you take stuff offline or you cause a denial of service condition, it has a very negative impact. It could have a cost impact. It could have a physical impact. Point is, it's probably next to safety, availability is probably the most important aspect on the ICS or OT side. And so I want to show you an example of some packets here that move into the DMP3 space. And so I highlighted there the identifiers for the DMP3 protocol. So if you look at the spec on the bottom right, an example of the spec of what the frames look like at a network level, you'll see that the first 2 bytes are hex 5, hex 64. And so when you see that, as you extract data off network contexts, you know that you're dealing with DMP3 data if you happen to see those bytes at a certain offset given an entire network packet. Moving beyond that, and remembering the notion of the function code, for DMP3 here, we see 0 delta. Here's a Wireshark snippet of a 0 delta function code. Now, the Wireshark dissector was nice enough there to give us the string name of the function, and you can see that it's a cold restart. Now, DMP3 as a protocol happens to provide a bunch of very useful functions from an administrative perspective, but there are also functions that can be abused from a cybersecurity perspective. And so if you see this type of traffic on a network and you can't stop it, the impact to an outstation, DMP3 is more of an energy power-based protocol. The impact on an outstation is obvious. If I start doing a bunch of restarts, whether cold or warm, or I start sending freeze commands, things are going to stop working on the receiving end. And so there will be an impact on the energy operations that are being controlled by the targeted equipment. So just to show you another example, again, you can see the identifiers there, and the function code 7 is an immediate freeze. And so identifying these things on the network is one thing. Taking action on them is something different. And we'll discuss some options at the end of this presentation, but right now, from a knowledge perspective, understanding this level of granularity, I think, is absolutely critical, because otherwise you just really don't know what it is you're protecting. So let me show you a video real quick of an EthernetIP example. EthernetIP is a separate protocol altogether. Now this one's interesting because we're going to force, you'll see in the video, we force a fault and the device just never comes back to life properly. So let me play this for you first. If you look on the right side, you'll see that the power and the run lights are in their normal green state. And we change the run state of the device and then start sending it commands. Now, none of this stuff is authenticated, which means that if you know how to talk to this device on the network and you know how to send these packets, you can have an impact. So if you notice on the left side, the screen refresh of the web interface, it shows you the CPU mode. So now on the right side, you see a red fault LED, and the CPU mode is faulted. So we forced a fault on this device using network traffic. I'll show you the Python snippet in a minute when this video is over. But the key part to pay attention to is the fact that we're going to actually take action to try to bring this guy back to life, and it just doesn't come back to its normal state. And so this would then require somebody with the engineering software that has the ability to reset this thing at its core level to bring it back to life. So the impact, I feel, is pretty clear. If you knew how to send these type of packets to a device like this, you can cause a massive disruption to an operation that's going to require substantial effort to bring the device back to a normal state. So we'll just let this play out so you guys can see, even when we reboot the device, it still does not come up. We're trying to clear the fault with the actual packets that clear the fault, and it looks like it works for a second, but the device will not start in its normal mode. See, we just tried to start it and it's still faulting. So we rebooted it. As you can see, the screen just went through its full refresh. So we figured it would come up at this point simply because it's been actually restarted. So there it's back on the network. It's responding to ping. And when we try to start it, which means the run light, the run LED would go back to green. It goes right back into fault mode. So this is a pretty deep problem if you know how to construct these packets based on the fact that you've identified this device on the network. This is, in my opinion, an enormous problem. So if you wanted to see some Python code, and I am urging all of you to not use this type of code, but if you wanted to see the Python code, that's it right there. I'll show you a Wireshark capture of these packets in a second, but basically what we highlighted there is what generates the traffic that puts this device into a pretty nasty state, as you just saw in that video. So one more video. This is a different protocol altogether, and this is a different type of attack altogether. So let's play this. So as you can see, we are sitting, these terminals are sitting on 100.84 on the left, and we're going to ping our target 127. And on top, we're going to set up Netcat to establish sockets to the target. On the right side, we're going to run our attack. And what you'll see on the left is that we will lose the ability to communicate with the device, as you can see right there, because we're basically flooding the device with very specifically crafted network packets that are causing the device to just not be able to handle the load, and it can't respond to proper activity. As soon as we stop, if you notice on the right, we stopped the attack, it'll start responding to pings, and in a couple of seconds, it'll actually establish, we'll be able to establish sockets on the top left because the device has come back to life. There we go. So this is what that traffic looks like in a Wireshark screenshot. And so you're talking about now flood type traffic, right? But the impact is obvious. If you think about the AIC aspect that I spoke about earlier, we just affected the availability of two totally different devices based on crafted packets because we know what the target endpoint is. We know what it's running, we know what protocol it speaks, and we are able to actually have a negative impact on those devices. So let me talk about some of the challenges in this space. I talked about the timing earlier. I can't stress it enough. The bounded latency constraints that we operate under are generally speaking very strict. And when you put a security device onto an IIoT network, you have to be extremely careful that it does not add a tremendous amount of latency because that will be unacceptable and it'll have a negative impact on things. And if you're a commercial entity, you're pretty much going to get thrown out the door because that's just unacceptable. False positives are always something that's of a challenge in any security endeavor, not just here. And so the false positive concern is always going to be there. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but another major challenge is the lack of knowledge. You know, a lot of cybersecurity experts, even in this space, when you show them the depth of what I just showed you guys, you know, they kind of look at it and you can tell that they just have no clue what you're talking about. And that's a problem because the lack of knowledge in this space is very prevalent, and it has a massive impact in terms of what you can actually do to protect an IIoT environment. So from a risk perspective, you know, there's always risk when you're putting a device in place that can take actual action on network traffic. But you know, from my perspective, and I think if you step back from the emotional aspect of all this and you think about it, there's tremendous risk if you don't put something in place. And so, you know, the risk areas in terms of the negative impact we could potentially have are disruptions to operation. And, you know, if you don't put a protective mechanism in place, you can cause even more disruptions. There could be physical damage, you could hurt human life, there could be reputational damage to the actual entity that's looking for the protection. So not doing something is just as bad as, you know, doing something that's going to cause some type of impact. But, you know, my argument's always been this. If I put something in place that causes a false positive that has an impact on one operation, one device, one aspect, one part of your network, that's radically different than a piece of malware, for instance, coming onto your environment and causing an all-out outage. And so I think from an active protection perspective, you always have to ask yourself, how much impact are you willing to accept in reference to either an attack or putting something in place that may cause a disruption? It may not, but it may cause a disruption. There's always that argument. And so, you know, certainly studying the subjective nature of the traffic within a given environment is critical to be able to put a protective mechanism in place that does a good job. Now, some of the recommendations you're always going to hear, I've listed some of them out there, patch management. I always chuckle when I hear that, because usually the people that are saying that are giving you a best practice spiel. But if you really operate in this space, you realize that some of these environments run Windows XP machines. Some run Windows NT machines, for Christ's sake. So I'd love to see those get patched. There are no patches that come out for them. So there's no patch management that you could put in place with any of those environments, such that you can actually improve your security posture. And so, patch management is a great best practice, but it's not always something that can actually work with environments that operate in a legacy mode. And a lot of the IIoT networks that exist out there, they're on 20, 30-year cycles in terms of actual upgrades or the recycling of equipment. So, how realistic is the patch management? I think it's always going to be a best practice, but you just got to be sensible in terms of what you expect as the outcome. Encryption is another one. There are a lot of people who have the battle cry of encryption, and encryption does stop somebody on the network from prying on your traffic, right? From seeing your traffic. But in a lot of cases, if you don't know how to do proper man-in-the-middle environments from a security perspective, it also kills the visibility of your own security personnel. They can't see the traffic the same way the attackers can. And so you got to really ask yourself whether that's an effective tool or not, because it could very well be hiding an attack. So how does your security team, how does your SOC personnel know that something nefarious is going on? Usually they find out when it hits the back-end device and there's a negative impact, but they weren't able to see it on the network if the streams were encrypted. So some of the atypical recommendations, which I'm more in line with these, is command whitelisting and possibly blacklisting, right? If you know the proper range of values for a given device, you can build sensible policies that exist on a network and can actually have a very positive impact on the overall environment. And if you can combine those with a device that gives you the ability to actually block, I think generally speaking, the outcome is positive. Being able to detect file types matters. When a firmware upgrade takes place, typically an HMI does a file transfer of this binary file over to the PLC so that the PLC can take on the firmware upgrade. Well, what if that file gets transferred from a different source? What if the file type is an executable and you don't want an executable? You have to be able to detect file types on the network and be able to take action against them. You can't do that in a passive mode. It has to be an active mode. And so understanding how each of these communication protocols performs file transfer, that's critical as well, because they don't all do it the same way. So just some simple recommendations if you're familiar with Yara. This is what Yara rule formats look like. I'm not going to go into depth here because I know we're tight on time, but Yara is certainly something that you want to take a look at and get familiar with. If you can write rules like this, you can start to detect the type of traffic that we're interested in. And so if you think back to the Recon example that I showed you with Modbus, the function code 2Bravo was something that was of interest to us. And if you look at the condition at the bottom of the rule, we're saying to look for this byte at offset 7. So that means we understand the protocol. And the protocol structure in this case, if you look at the left side of the PDU, you'll see that there are 7 bytes. So that's from offset 0 to 6, which means byte 7, the first byte of the PDU, is the function code. And so that should hit home with the bottom of that rule right there. We're looking for that function code at that offset. And if that triggers, then we can take action or report on it or whatever it is we want to do. The DMP3 example, one I covered earlier, we know the identifier for DMP3, hex 564, and then we know the function code that we're interested in terms of a cold restart. Obviously, you'd write a bunch of these, or you'd have a bunch of OR statements based on the function codes that you're looking for. Just to show you from a structural perspective there, if you start counting at 0.5, treat that as offset 0. In other words, the network context would strip out all of the other network data and give you the protocol data. And if you count across, you'll see that the actual function code is at offset 12. So conceptually, an engine that would be effective to use rules like those looks like this. So the context comes up off the network stack, which means you're getting raw network data. You have your rules that come into play, and then you have a verb that has the action statement based on the rule triggering off the context data and passing along a disposition for some action to potentially be taken. I mean, obviously this is just conceptual, but some of us have built this. So some forward-looking thoughts as we wrap up here. You know, malware has become very sophisticated. If you think of Stuxnet, it's even been weaponized at this point. And so we have to start thinking a little differently in terms of protecting IIoT environments, because like you just saw, the nature of the actual traffic is just it's not the norm in terms of cybersecurity. So it really warrants a deep understanding of these protocols. You know, worms, rats, and rootkits become really interesting because, like I said earlier, you can't run AV on a PLC, but you can get some malicious code into that PLC if you understand this runtime environment. And so then you can have these like PLC Blaster, you have PLC to PLC malware propagation, and all of a sudden you have a real problem on your hands that if you don't know how to detect it on the network, you can't do anything about it. And so from a malware perspective, you know, when you look at the advanced stuff, you're looking at polymorphic and metamorphic entities. I listed some of the attributes there. You guys can certainly do your own research on this, but the detection of these type of executables is becoming more and more difficult because the sophistication that the code is bringing to the table is changing. And obviously that has an impact on the enterprise side, but on the OT side, the impact, if you ask me, is worse because the potential outcome in terms of negative impact is greater, and the ability to detect this stuff is far more difficult because you don't have, you know, PCs with 16 gigs of RAM running inside, you know, of one of these devices. You probably have a real-time operating system and like a meg of RAM, and that's all you're going to get. You're not going to be able to run sophisticated, you know, heuristic-based AV in an environment like that. It just doesn't happen. So as a quick bonus, I just wanted to touch upon whether or not there is a play related to warfare in reference to everything I just showed you. And I'm going to show you two examples that basically force an answer of yes. So this anti-aircraft cannon that you're looking at is 100% software controlled, remote controlled. So the fact that an operator can sit somewhere and send actual packets using the exact same protocols that we covered today in some of these cases and have an impact on this weapon is, well, from a tech perspective, it's kind of fascinating. From a human perspective, it's certainly something that is of interest. And unfortunately, in this case, in 2007, there was an incident with this exact weapon that caused loss of life. The weapon has an automatic mode where it operates off sensors, and it can automatically reload and perform all kinds of interesting functions. And, you know, I'll leave it up to you to think about the implications of some of the stuff I showed today if that type of injection of traffic was to happen against an endpoint like this, right? Because spinning a motor out of control is one thing. Making a weapon act in a way that it's not supposed to is something very different. I gave you guys the link there for the article, for one of the articles on that weapon in case you're interested. And I'll finish it off with one video here of another incident. So the disturbing part of that is that that gun was never supposed to have turned around all the way towards the camera people. As a matter of fact, it wasn't supposed to have turned around at all. And so the people that were familiar with this project, to my understanding, they've never been able to figure out exactly what made that device turn the way it did. But again, this is another autonomous vehicle that can be remote controlled. And so from an actual protocol level perspective, you're looking at data just the same way that I showed you earlier in the examples in the DMP3 and Modbus examples. But the endpoint is obviously different, right? We're not looking at a PLC. We're looking at a device that can actually have quite an impact on human life. And that wraps up my presentation. So thank you. There's my email address in case anybody has questions or comments or anything of the sort.
Thank you very much, Andres. This was a very insightful session and great information, I must say. And thank you everyone else for joining. We will be sharing the recording of this video and the slide deck with you on your emails. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We have our email address. We have Andres' email address as well. And once again, Andres, this was a very great and insightful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.